Here are some data availabilities of several systems out there now that illustrate pretty well the reliability of sorbent trap systems. As you can see, these particular systems are in the 90% or above range of data availability. Generally speaking, sorbent trap systems are fairly simple mechanically, and if you do have downtime, it's usually fairly quickly rectified. Initially, we were concerned that we would have a lot of data loss from trap QA/QC issues. However, some of the measures that were incorporated in Part 75 last January, such as the single trap adjustment factor, do a pretty good job of ensuring against the total loss of data, albeit not without a little bias towards maximizing the value that we have to report. A year or so ago, there was some concern in meeting the sorbent trap QA/QC requirements of Appendix K. Although there was a lot of short-term data saying that it should be possible, the performance of full-scale systems was a little bit of an unknown. These are some of the more prominent criteria that we worry about from the sorbent trap side. Passing a RAT, of course, passing the spike recovery and breakthrough limits, and getting good agreement between the results from the two traps. I'm going to show some data for the first three of these. What we found with the relative deviation is that unless there's a problem with breakthrough or a mechanical problem with the sampler, the pair trap agreement pretty much always passes. Here's a RATA for a system where the average mercury concentration was around 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter. The reference method in this case was the EPA method 30B, which of course is also a sorbent trap method. As you can see, there are very good agreement at this level, with the relative accuracy just a little over 5% and no Part 75 bias. Here's another plant where the concentration is even lower, this time just a little over 1 microgram. Still, the relative accuracy is less than 10%, and once again, no bias. The hardest part of passing a RAT at these levels is really just getting all of the trap QA/QC criteria of both the reference method and the sorbent trap method to pass. If you succeed on that front, then getting good agreement between the reference method and the SIMs is generally not a problem. Let's talk about spike recoveries. We were initially concerned with how well long-term spike recoveries would hold up in plants burning PRB coal. Here's some spike recovery data for several plants burning coal with anywhere from 60 to 100% PRB. This is 58 pairs of traps over about a 6-month period. The green solid triangles all meet the 100 plus or minus 25% Appendix K criteria. The red open triangles do not. I plotted the recoveries versus total sample volume. Sample times in these cases range anywhere from a couple of days to 2 weeks. There's two things I want to point out. First, the majority of the data meets the criteria. Second, there's not a real strong correlation between sample volume and recovery in this particular data set. Here's the same data set now looking at breakthrough. The solid blue points meet the 5% maximum limit specified in Appendix K, and the red open squares do not. Here it is quite obvious that once you've exceeded about 6 cubic meters of sample volume, your chance of meeting the criteria pretty much goes away. We've seen this type of boundary effect repeated plant after plant for breakthrough. Let's look at 100% bituminous coal data. Here are data from 55 pairs of traps from 2 different stacks over a 9-month period. Once again, there's not an obvious correlation between spike recovery and sample volume. However, there may be a relationship between the probability of a spike failure and an increase in the sample volume. Below around 1.5 cubic meters, all of the spike values pass. From 1.5 to 2 cubic meters, you see around 10% failure. Around 2 cubic meters, 15% failure, and 20% failure from 2 to 3 cubic meters. Finally, about 60% failure once you go above 3 cubic meters. And once again, the same type of barrier volume is seen with breakthrough as with PRB. The difference, though, is, although not as clear as before, it looks like somewhere around 2 cubic meters is where you see the breakdown in this data set. Now you might wonder why this critical volume occurs so much lower than what we saw with the PRB coal. Remember that point was closer to 6 cubic meters. Well, in general, the mercury concentrations in the PRB stacks represented here are a little lower than that of the bituminous stacks. So for a given volume, you get a lower loading with PRB than unscrubbed bituminous. But look what happens when we plot breakthrough versus Section 1 loading. This data is for both sets, of data combined, PRB and bituminous. You'll get very similar looking plots if you look at each coal separately. Essentially, there is no correlation with loading, so it's more likely there's something else in the flue gas chemistry that is at work here, such as chlorine or sulfur oxides, both of which have been discussed by myself and others in previous presentations. So the point I'm trying to make with all of this is that one of the biggest lessons we've learned over the last year or so, starting up these systems, is that you can't overestimate the importance of planning and doing some work up front before committing to a long-term monitoring plan. No two plants are alike. Unless you're really lucky, it's going to take a little time to find that sweet spot for your sampling parameters. There are numerous things to consider, from trap manufacturer to sample duration, sample rate, spike level, and these are all interrelated. There's other factors that you may not consider that could blindside you. A good example of this might be the effect of ammonia slip-on operation. Our experience thus far is that you need to allow about 3 months or so to work through all this prior to going completely live with the system. So to conclude, we've certainly been able to add to the learning curve for long-term operation of sorbent trap systems, and I think we've got the data to prove that sorbent trap monitoring would have worked for federal CAMR, and indeed is working for several state CAMR type programs. Most of the trap-related and analytical issues that people agonized over a year or so ago have been resolved by the industry. Of course, there's always room for improvement. And given their ability to measure repeatably and reliably at low concentrations, sorbent traps may lead the technology if something like MACT comes along and forces concentrations exceedingly low. And to anyone in this business that has committed the last several years to making sorbent trap systems commercially viable, only to get sidetracked in the last year, remember, it's always darkest before the dawn.